My name is Eleanor Thompson, and at 67 years old, I never expected to be fighting for my dignity after losing Harold, my husband of 35 wonderful years. The morning after we buried him, my stepchildren Bradley and Audrey showed up at our home with moving boxes and a document they claimed was his will. "You need to be out by the end of the month," Bradley told me with cold eyes I hardly recognized. I stood in the foyer of the home Harold and I had built together, clutching his wedding ring in my palm, completely blindsided by their betrayal. If you're watching this from somewhere that's experienced family turning on you after a loss, please hit like and subscribe before I tell you how my late husband's true final wishes came to light and changed everything. I met Harold Thompson when I was 32 years old, both of us attending a charity auction for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I was newly divorced from a brief, unhappy first marriage and working as an assistant curator at the museum. Harold, at 45, was already a successful real estate developer with a reputation for restoring historic properties throughout New England. He outbid everyone for a painting I had specifically recommended for the auction, then asked me to dinner to learn more about the artist. "I bought it because I saw how your eyes lit up when you described it," he admitted over our first meal together. That was Harold, observant, thoughtful, and surprisingly sentimental for a businessman with his reputation. Our courtship moved quickly but deliberately. Harold had been a widower for 5 years, his wife Caroline having passed from cancer when their children were still teenagers. Bradley was 17 and Audrey 14 when I met them, already guarded and suspicious of the woman spending time with their father. "They just need time," Harold assured me when Bradley refused to join us for dinner, or when Audrey answered my questions with monosyllabic responses. They still missed their mother terribly. I understood their reluctance and tried to be patient. I never attempted to replace Caroline in their lives, but I did hope we might eventually form some kind of family bond. Harold proposed 6 months after we met, presenting me with an antique emerald ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I want to build a new life with you, Eleanor," he said, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "We have so many good years ahead." The wedding was beautiful but tense. Bradley attended only after Harold insisted, standing stiffly in his suit and barely acknowledging me during the reception. Audrey performed her bridesmaid duties with mechanical precision, her smile never reaching her eyes when photographs were taken. Harold's sister Patricia pulled me aside during the reception. "Give them time, Eleanor. They adored Caroline and this is hard for them. They'll come around when they see how happy you make Harold." But Patricia was wrong. Over our 35 years together, Bradley and Audrey never truly accepted me. They maintained a polite facade when necessary, attended holiday gatherings with their own growing families, but always kept an emotional distance that no amount of kindness on my part seemed able to bridge. I tried countless times over the decades. I remembered birthdays with thoughtful gifts, celebrated their accomplishments, welcomed Bradley's wife Stephanie and Audrey's husband Richard into the family. When grandchildren came along, I doted on them as if they were my own flesh and blood. Harold and I never had children together. We met too late for that, so his grandchildren became the children I never had. "Your persistence is admirable," Harold would say after another strained family dinner where conversation remained superficial and tense. "But don't let it hurt you too much, my love. Some wounds run too deep to fully heal." He was referring to their mother's death, of course. Caroline had been beloved, by all accounts a warm and devoted mother. Her battle with cancer had been brutal, and the children had watched her decline over 2 painful years. I understood their lingering grief and their resistance to seeing another woman in their father's life. Still, after decades, their continued coldness sometimes felt deliberate rather than protective. Harold built us a beautiful life regardless. Our home in Brookline was a lovingly restored Victorian with a garden I tended passionately. Harold's business, Thompson Historic Properties, grew into one of the most respected development firms in Massachusetts, known for thoughtful preservation work and community-minded projects. I eventually became the head curator at the museum before retiring 5 years ago. We traveled extensively, developed a circle of dear friends, supported arts organizations, and hosted dinner parties famous for their lively conversations. If there was a shadow over our happiness, it was only the distant relationship with Harold's children. "Do you regret that they never warmed to me?" I asked Harold on our 30th anniversary, I regret their stubbornness and what they've missed by not truly knowing you, he answered, taking my hand. But I have never for one moment regretted choosing you as my partner, Eleanor. In the last year of his life, Harold's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first. Some shortness of breath, fatigue that seemed excessive. He brushed off my concerns until a dizzy spell at the office forced him to see his doctor. The diagnosis was heart disease, requiring medication and lifestyle changes. Harold made the adjustments with minimal complaint, though I know it frustrated him to scale back his work and exercise routines. 2 weeks before his death, Harold had a strange conversation with me that I would only fully understand much later. "I need you to know something, Eleanor," he said as we sat in the garden, watching the evening light fade. "No matter what happens, everything I've done has been to protect what matters most." When I asked what he meant, he squeezed my hand and changed the subject. Looking back, I believe he was trying to prepare me, perhaps planning to explain the changes he'd made to his will. But he never got the chance to finish that conversation. 3 days later, while reviewing plans for a new project in his home office, Harold suffered a massive heart attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The week following Harold's death passed in a blur of grief and arrangements. I moved through those days as if underwater, sounds muffled and movements slowed by the weight of loss. Harold had left general instructions for his funeral. He wanted to be cremated, with a memorial service at the Episcopal church we occasionally attended, but the details fell to me. Surprisingly, Bradley and Audrey were immediately present, and involved in a way they had never been before. Bradley called daily, offering to handle communications with the business associates and extended family. Audrey arrived the day after Harold died, staying at a nearby hotel but spending hours at the house helping with arrangements. "Dad would want us to take care of everything," she said, her hand on my shoulder in a rare gesture of comfort. "You just focus on yourself right now." Their attentiveness should have been comforting, but something about it felt calculated. I noticed them having whispered conversations that abruptly ended when I entered rooms. Once, I overheard Bradley on the phone mentioning the timeline we discussed, before quickly changing his tone when he realized I was nearby. "Is everything all right?" my friend Martha asked when she came by with food 2 days after Harold's death. Martha and her husband Thomas had been our closest friends for decades, the 4 of us sharing countless dinners and vacations together. "Bradley and Audrey are being very helpful," I said, not wanting to voice my vague suspicions. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's unexpected. How are they behaving toward you?" "Solicitous. Almost too much so," I admitted. "But grief affects everyone differently." "Yes," Martha said slowly. "It certainly does." The day of the funeral arrived, cold and clear. The church filled with people whose lives Harold had touched: business associates, friends, charitable connections, even tenants from buildings he'd developed who came to pay respects to a landlord they admired. I sat in the front pew, Bradley and Audrey flanking me like honor guards. Bradley delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking at carefully timed intervals as he spoke of his father's business acumen, community contributions, and love for his children. He mentioned me primarily as Dad's companion in his later years, a phrasing that subtly diminished our 35-year marriage but that only I seemed to notice. At the reception afterward, held at our home, I moved through rooms filled with sympathetic faces offering condolences. Several of Harold's longtime business partners expressed their own grief, telling me how much they would miss his wisdom and integrity. "Harold always said you were his moral compass," William Chun, his oldest associate, told me quietly. "In business and in life." Audrey overheard this and quickly interrupted. "Dad always considered his partnerships the backbone of his success," she said, steering William away. "He mentioned wanting to discuss the Charleston project with you before he passed." As the last guests departed, I found myself exhausted beyond measure, wanting only to retreat to the quiet of our bedroom and process my grief privately. But Bradley cleared his throat as Thomas and Martha were saying their goodbyes. "Eleanor, Audrey, and I need to discuss some practical matters with you," he said. "About the house and Dad's business." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Surely that can wait a few days, Bradley. Your stepmother just buried her husband. Unfortunately, some things require immediate attention." Audrey interjected smoothly. Business continuity issues. We won't keep her long. After my friends reluctantly left, promising to check on me tomorrow, Bradley, Audrey, and I sat in Harold's study, a room of warm wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that still held his presence so strongly I could barely breathe. We know this is difficult, Bradley began, his tone businesslike, but Dad would have wanted things settled quickly. What things? I asked, feeling suddenly alert despite my exhaustion. The transition, Audrey said. Of the house, the business, the assets. Bradley nodded. Dad always intended for Thompson properties to pass to us. It's our family legacy. And this house, Audrey added, glancing around critically, has been in the Thompson family for generations. Dad would want it to stay with blood relatives. I stared at them in confusion. Harold and I never discussed any of this. He wouldn't have wanted to upset you, Bradley said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But he was clear about his wishes. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document, sliding it across the desk toward me. This is Dad's will. As you can see, the business passes to us jointly, and the house to me specifically, since I have 3 children who need the space. I picked up the papers with trembling hands, unable to properly focus on the legal language swimming before my eyes. There's a generous provision for you, Audrey added, her tone suggesting I should be grateful. Enough for a comfortable apartment and living expenses. We think you should take some time away, Bradley continued. A fresh start. Maybe that cottage on Cape Cod you've mentioned liking. I looked up from the document, my shock giving way to indignation. This is my home. Harold and I built our life here for 35 years. It was Dad's home first, Audrey corrected coldly. And now it's time for the next generation of Thompsons to live here. We can give you 30 days to pack your personal belongings, Bradley added as if offering a generous concession. Stephanie already has some ideas for redecorating. I felt as though I'd been struck. The casual cruelty of discussing redecorating the home I shared with Harold, whose body we had just laid to rest hours ago, was breathtaking. For the first time since Harold's death, my grief was momentarily overshadowed by something else, the dawning realization that my stepchildren had been planning this ambush all along. The days following the funeral brought a steady escalation of Bradley and Audrey's campaign to claim Harold's estate. I awoke the morning after our confrontation hoping their behavior had been an aberration brought on by grief, but those hopes were quickly dashed when I came downstairs to find Audrey in the living room with a notepad, cataloging items. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said without looking up. "I'm just taking inventory of Dad's collectibles. The maritime paintings should stay with the family, don't you think?" Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Bradley entered with his wife Stephanie, carrying empty boxes and packing materials. "We thought we'd start with Dad's office," Bradley announced. "All those business files need to be transferred to our possession right away." "I haven't agreed to any of this," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "This is still my home, and those are still my husband's belongings." Bradley's expression hardened. "The will is quite clear, Eleanor. You're welcome to have your own lawyer review it, but I assure you it's binding." That afternoon, I discovered Audrey had scheduled meetings with Harold's business partners for the following week. Meetings I hadn't been informed about, much less invited to attend. "It's just routine business continuity discussions," she explained dismissively when I confronted her. "There's really no need for you to be there. You never took an active role in the company anyway." Her words stung because they contained a grain of truth. While I had attended company functions and knew most of Harold's associates socially, I hadn't been involved in day-to-day operations. Harold had always handled business matters, though we discussed major decisions together. "Harold shared everything with me," I insisted. "I may not have been in the office, but I was his partner in every sense." Audrey's smile was pitying. "I'm sure that's how you saw it." As the week progressed, their tactics grew more aggressive. Credit cards I'd shared with Harold were suddenly declined when I attempted to purchase groceries. Online passwords to financial accounts had been changed. When I called our bank to inquire about access to our joint checking account, I was informed that Bradley had already been in contact with them, presenting himself as the executor of Harold's estate. "Is that legal?" I asked Martha during one of her daily check-in visits. Can they just take control like this? Absolutely not, Martha said firmly. She and Thomas had become increasingly concerned about the situation. Not without proper legal authority. Eleanor, you need to talk to Harold's lawyer. Lawrence Goldstein, I murmured. Harold's worked with him for decades. Have you called him? Thomas asked. I shook my head. Bradley said Lawrence knew about the will and had helped draft it. Martha and Thomas exchanged glances. Call him anyway, Thomas urged. Something doesn't add up here. But I hesitated, still struggling with conflicting emotions. Despite their behavior, Bradley and Audrey were Harold's children. Fighting them felt like betraying Harold somehow. My reluctance to take action emboldened them further. Bradley began bringing business associates to the house for meetings in Harold's study, pointedly not introducing me when I encountered them. Audrey made comments within my hearing about Dad's trophy wife, and how I'd certainly landed on my feet marrying a wealthy older man. The situation reached a breaking point 10 days after the funeral. I returned from a grief counseling session to find Bradley in our bedroom, rummaging through Harold's dresser. What are you doing? I demanded. Looking for Dad's watch collection, he replied without apology. And his wedding ring. We need those items for the family. The ring is with me, I said, my hand instinctively moving to where it hung on a chain around my neck. Harold would have wanted me to have it. Bradley straightened, his expression cold. That ring belonged to my grandmother. It's a Thompson family heirloom, not something for Dad's second wife to keep. I was his wife for 35 years, I said, my voice rising. This was his choice to give to me. And now he's gone and things are returning to their proper place, Bradley countered. He held out his hand. The ring, Eleanor. Don't make this difficult. I backed away, clutching the ring through my blouse. No. This is one thing I won't give up. Bradley's face flushed with anger. We'll see about that. There are legal ways to recover family property. The final straw came the next day when Audrey arrived with an art appraiser and began assessing the paintings and sculptures Harold and I had collected throughout our marriage. What exactly is happening here? I asked, watching the stranger making notes about a sculpture we'd purchased in Florence on our 25th anniversary. Just getting valuations, Audrey said casually. For insurance purposes. These are my possessions, I said firmly. Purchased during my marriage to your father. The appraiser looked uncomfortable, glancing between us. Actually, Audrey said with a thin smile, they're marital assets subject to the terms of the prenuptial agreement you signed, according to which, art and collectibles remain Thompson family property. I stared at her in shock. What prenuptial agreement? I never signed any such document. Audrey's expression faltered momentarily before she regained her composure. That's not what Dad told us. Perhaps you've forgotten. In that moment, looking at her calculating eyes, I finally accepted what my friends had been telling me. This was a coordinated effort to disinherit me, likely planned well before Harold's death. And they were willing to lie, manipulate, and forge documents to achieve it. That evening, with my hands shaking but my resolve firm, I finally placed a call to Lawrence Goldstein's office and scheduled an urgent appointment. Lawrence Goldstein's law office occupied the top floor of a restored brownstone in downtown Boston. I'd been there many times with Harold over the years for document signings or meetings about charitable foundations we supported. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry for your loss, she said warmly. Mr. Goldstein is expecting you. Lawrence himself met me at his office door. A tall, thin man in his 70s with a shock of white hair, and the energetic manner of someone decades younger. He'd been Harold's friend as well as his attorney for over 40 years. Eleanor, he said, embracing me briefly. I've been meaning to call you. I was at a conference in London when Harold passed and only returned yesterday. My deepest condolences. Thank you, Lawrence, I said, fighting back tears at his genuine warmth after days of dealing with Bradley and Audrey's cold calculation. Once seated in his office with tea served, I explained the situation the will Bradley had presented, their claims about the business and house, the pressure to vacate my home, and the various financial manipulations already underway. Lawrence's bushy eyebrows drew together as I spoke, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Eleanor, he interrupted finally, I'm confused. Bradley claims I drafted this while leaving everything to him and Audrey. Yes, I confirmed. He said it was Harold's long-standing intention for the business and properties to stay with his blood relatives. Lawrence set down his teacup with a sharp click. That is absolutely false. I never drafted such a document, and it certainly doesn't reflect Harold's wishes as he expressed them to me. A wave of relief washed over me, followed immediately by anger at the deception. What were Harold's wishes then? I asked quietly. Lawrence rose and walked to a large safe in the corner of his office. Harold updated his will 6 months ago, he said as he worked the combination. After his initial diagnosis, he wanted to ensure everything was in order. He returned with a sealed envelope and a thick document folder. This is Harold's actual will, properly witnessed and filed with the court. And this, he held up the envelope, is a personal letter he asked me to give you in the event of his death. My hands trembled as I took the envelope, recognizing Harold's handwriting immediately. But I set it aside for the moment. What does the will say? I asked. Lawrence opened the folder. In essence, Harold left you the Brookline house outright, a controlling interest of 60% in Thompson Historic Properties, and the majority of his liquid assets and investment accounts. Bradley and Audrey each received 20% shares in the business and equal portions of the remaining financial assets. I sat back stunned. That's very different from what they claimed. Drastically different, Lawrence agreed, his expression grim. The document Bradley showed you must be either completely fabricated or perhaps an early draft from years ago that Harold discarded. Either way, it has no legal standing whatsoever. But why would Harold leave them so little of the business they expected to inherit? I wondered aloud, though part of me already suspected the answer. Lawrence sighed. That's where things get complicated. Harold had been keeping detailed records of his interactions with his children for years, particularly regarding business matters. He shared his concerns with me during our estate planning discussions. Over the next hour, Lawrence revealed a pattern of behavior that Harold had largely kept hidden from me. Bradley and Audrey had repeatedly taken advantage of their father's generosity, borrowing substantial sums for business ventures that inevitably failed, requiring bailouts. Harold had gifted them both homes outright in their 20s, which they had promptly mortgaged to fund lavish lifestyles. Most troubling were the documented attempts to turn Harold against me over the years, suggesting I was spending too much of their inheritance, questioning my influence over charitable donations, even once hiring a private investigator to follow me in hopes of finding evidence of infidelity. Harold protected you from the worst of it, Lawrence explained gently. He hoped until the end that they would mature and accept you, but he wasn't blind to their behavior. I had no idea it was this bad, I whispered, thinking of all the times Harold had seemed troubled after interactions with his children but had brushed off my concerns. There's more, Lawrence continued. About 3 years ago, Harold discovered Bradley had been diverting company resources for personal use, charging personal renovations to business accounts, using company contractors for his vacation home. When confronted, Bradley became belligerent and threatened to contest any will that didn't give him control of the company. I thought of Bradley's confident assertion about the will and his claim to be executor. Could they challenge the real will? They can try, Lawrence said. But Harold anticipated that possibility. He underwent thorough cognitive and psychological evaluations when updating his will specifically to counter any claims of diminished capacity. He also documented his reasons for the distribution decisions. Their case would be extremely weak. Finally, I opened Harold's letter with unsteady hands, tears blurring my vision as I read. My dearest Eleanor, asterisk. If you're reading this, I've left you sooner than either of us wanted. I'm sorry for that, and for the difficulties you may face in the aftermath. I've tried to protect you as best I could. Asterisk. You may be surprised by the provisions in my will, particularly regarding Bradley and Audrey. Please know that these decisions weren't made lightly. Despite my hopes and countless opportunities, my children have shown themselves to be motivated primarily by self-interest rather than family loyalty or business integrity. Asterisk. I've shielded you from their worst behavior over the years, hoping things would improve. Instead, I've watched them squander opportunities and resources while treating you with barely disguised contempt. I cannot reward such behavior by placing my life's work, or more importantly, your security, in their hands. Asterisk. You have been my partner, my joy, and my moral compass for 35 years. Everything we built together. The business flourished because of your support and counsel behind the scenes. Our home has been filled with love because of your presence. Asterisk. Trust Lawrence to guide you through any challenges. And know that whatever happens, my deepest wish is for you to continue living with the same generosity and integrity that made me fall in love with you all those years ago. Asterisk. Oh my love always asterisk. Harold asterisk. I clutched the letter to my chest, overwhelmed by grief renewed and a profound sense of connection with Harold even after his death. He had known what might happen and had prepared for it. He had protected me one final time. What happens now? I asked Lawrence when I could speak again. Now, he said with determination, we set the record straight. 3 days later, I sat beside Lawrence in the conference room of his law firm, hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. Across the polished mahogany table sat Bradley and Audrey, flanked by a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who had introduced himself as Julian Mercer, their attorney. Bradley looked irritated at being summoned. Audrey maintained an expression of concerned sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. I appreciate you arranging this meeting, Lawrence, Bradley began with forced cordiality, though I'm not sure what required such urgency. We're all still grieving after all. Indeed, Lawrence replied evenly. Grief can sometimes complicate matters, which is why clarity is essential right now. He opened a folder before him. I've asked you here to discuss the administration of Harold Thompson's estate, as I am the executor of his will. Bradley's confident smile faltered slightly. There must be some confusion. The will names me as executor. The document you've been presenting is not your father's valid will, Lawrence stated flatly. It appears to be either fraudulent or an outdated draft. Either way, it has no legal standing. The atmosphere in the room instantly chilled. Julian Mercer leaned forward, his expression alarmed. That's a serious accusation, Goldstein. It's not an accusation, it's a statement of fact, Lawrence replied calmly. Harold Thompson executed his final will and testament in my office 6 months ago. It was properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with the Suffolk County Probate Court. He slid copies across the table. This is the only valid will. Bradley snatched the document, his face flushing dark red as he scanned the contents. Audrey leaned in to read over his shoulder, her composed facade cracking as she reached the asset distribution section. This can't be right, she whispered, then louder. This isn't what Dad wanted. I watched them, feeling an odd detachment as their confident entitlement crumbled before my eyes. Part of me had still hoped, even after everything, that there had been some misunderstanding rather than deliberate deception. Your father was very clear about his wishes, Lawrence continued. The Brookline residence passes directly to Eleanor. She receives 60% ownership of Thompson Historic Properties, with you each receiving 20%. The remaining assets are distributed as outlined on page 4. This is ridiculous. Bradley slammed the document down. Dad would never leave control of his company to her. He jabbed a finger in my direction without looking at me. She knows nothing about the business. Harold felt differently, Lawrence replied. In fact, he left a letter explaining his reasoning. He nodded to me. With steady hands, I removed a copy of Harold's letter from my purse and began reading portions aloud. The parts about their financial irresponsibility, the diverted company resources, their treatment of me over the years. With each sentence, Bradley's face grew darker while Audrey's crumpled into tears. She manipulated him. Audrey cried when I finished. He would never have written these things otherwise. She turned him against us. That's your position? Lawrence asked. That Eleanor somehow manipulated your father into disinheriting his children after 35 years of marriage, during which he consistently supported you financially? Julian Mercer looked increasingly uncomfortable. My clients believe their father may not have been of sound mind when this document was prepared, he offered. Mr. Thompson's health was declining. Anticipated and addressed, Lawrence responded smoothly, producing another folder. Harold underwent comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluation by 3 separate specialists before executing this will. All certified him fully competent. He also recorded a video statement explaining his decisions in his own words, which we're prepared to play for the court if necessary. He turned to Bradley and Audrey directly. Your father was not manipulated or confused. He was disappointed and concerned about your behavior and judgment. He structured his will to protect both his legacy and his wife. Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. This is bullshit. We'll contest it. I don't care how many doctors he saw. You certainly can try, Lawrence acknowledged. But I should inform you that the will contains a no contest clause. If you challenge and lose, which you will, you forfeit even the 20% shares you've been granted. He can't do that, Audrey protested. He absolutely can and did, Lawrence confirmed. Additionally, I feel obligated to mention that any continuation of your current behavior, changing passwords, canceling credit cards, removing property from the Brookline residence, could be construed as elder abuse and harassment, opening you to both civil and criminal liability. Julian Mercer placed a restraining hand on Bradley's arm. I believe we should discuss this privately before proceeding further, he said quietly. She doesn't deserve any of it, Bradley spat, glaring at me. 35 years playing the devoted wife, just waiting for him to die so she could take everything. For the first time since the meeting began, I spoke directly to my stepchildren. I loved your father with all my heart, I said, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions within me. I would give everything in that will to have him back for just one more day. But since that's impossible, I intend to honor his wishes and protect what he built. This isn't over, Audrey hissed as she gathered her belongings. Actually, Lawrence interjected. It can be. You can accept your father's wishes with grace, receive your substantial inheritances, and maintain your positions in the company. Or you can fight, risk losing everything, and spend years in costly litigation. Harold hoped you would make the wiser choice. Bradley's laugh was bitter. Of course you'd say that. What's your cut of all this, Lawrence? The attorney's expression hardened. I've represented your father for 40 years. He was my friend as well as my client. That you would immediately assume financial motivation speaks volumes about your own values, Bradley. After they stormed out, with Julian Mercer apologizing awkwardly in their wake, I remained seated in the suddenly quiet conference room. The confrontation had left me drained but strangely peaceful. Are you all right? Lawrence asked gently. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. For the first time since Harold died, I think I am. The weight of Bradley and Audrey's machinations had been crushing me nearly as much as my grief. Now, with the truth revealed and Harold's final protections engaged, I could begin to face both the loss and the future on firmer ground. They'll probably still contest, Lawrence warned. I know, I nodded. But Harold knew his children. He would have expected nothing less. As Lawrence predicted, Bradley and Audrey filed to contest the will less than a week after our confrontation. Their petition alleged undue influence on my part, claiming I had isolated Harold from his children during his illness and manipulated him into changing his will. They demanded the court throw out the current will, and either reinstate an earlier version, the document Bradley had originally presented, or apply intestate succession laws that would give them larger shares of the estate. It's a weak case, Lawrence assured me when he called with the news. But they're hoping to wear you down with legal delays and expenses until you agree to a settlement. I won't settle, I said firmly. Not after everything Harold did to prevent exactly this situation. The next months became a crash course in legal proceedings, business administration, and personal resilience. Bradley and Audrey's lawsuit necessitated a thorough inventory of Harold's assets, collection of medical records, and depositions from anyone with knowledge of his mental state or our marriage. The legal machinery ground slowly forward, consuming time and emotional energy I would rather have devoted to processing my grief. Simultaneously, I found myself thrust into a business world I had observed from the periphery but never directly participated in. Thompson Historic Properties couldn't simply pause during litigation. Projects were underway, employees needed leadership, and clients required reassurance. "I don't know if I can do this," I confessed to Martha over coffee one morning, showing her the stack of reports Lawrence's associate had dropped off for my review. "Harold handled all of this." "But he talked to you about it," Martha reminded me. "For 35 years he shared his work with you. You know more than you think you do." She was right, I realized. While I hadn't been involved in day-to-day operations, I had been Harold's sounding board for decades. I knew the company's philosophy, major projects, key personnel, and most important clients. Harold's business partner, William Chun, proved an unexpected ally as well. "Harold always said you had the best eye for which historic elements were worth preserving," William told me during our first meeting after I'd formally taken my majority ownership position. "He valued your perspective more than he ever let on publicly." With William's guidance and Lawrence's legal protection, I began attending business meetings and site visits. The initial awkwardness, being the widow suddenly in charge, gradually gave way to growing confidence as I discovered I did indeed have valuable contributions to make. My background in art and architectural history gave me insights that complemented the more technical expertise of our team. Meanwhile, the lawsuit proceeded through increasingly uncomfortable revelations. The discovery process unearthed evidence that not only supported Harold's concerns, but suggested even worse behavior than he'd documented. Financial records showed Bradley had used company resources for personal expenses far exceeding what Harold had discovered. Audrey had attempted to leverage her father's name and company connections to secure positions on prestigious boards, making commitments Harold hadn't authorized. Most disturbingly, text messages obtained during discovery revealed Bradley and Audrey had been plotting to challenge Harold's will even before his death, apparently aware he had updated it, but not knowing the specific provisions. "Planning to contest Dad's will while he was still alive," I murmured, reading Lawrence's summary of the latest findings. "How could they? People show their true characters when inheritance is involved," Lawrence said sadly. "I've seen it countless times in my career." As painful as these revelations were, they strengthened our legal position. Several of Harold's longtime friends and business associates came forward voluntarily to provide statements about his mental clarity in his final months and his concerns about his children's behavior. "Harold confided in me about Bradley's financial improprieties last year," Edward Sullivan, his college roommate and lifelong friend, stated in his deposition. He was deeply disappointed but completely lucid in his assessment of the situation. He was concerned about protecting both the business and Eleanor's future. 6 months into the litigation, an unexpected ally emerged when Stephanie, Bradley's wife, filed for divorce and contacted Lawrence with information. "Bradley has been lying about everything," she told us during a discreet meeting at Lawrence's office. "He's known all along that the will he presented wasn't valid. He found an old draft in Harold's home office years ago and kept it, thinking he could use it someday." Her testimony proved the final blow to their already weakening case. Faced with mounting evidence against them and the looming threat of the no contest clause, Julian Mercer finally advised his clients to withdraw their petition. "They'll drop the case," Lawrence informed me one autumn afternoon, 8 months after Harold's death, "but they want a meeting first. Are you willing to hear them out?" The meeting took place in the same conference room where we'd confronted them with the real will. Bradley and Audrey looked diminished somehow. Bradley's usual swagger replaced by tense rigidity, Audrey's polished appearance slightly frayed at the edges. "We're prepared to withdraw our petition," Bradley stated without preamble, "in exchange for guaranteed positions on the company board and increased dividends from our shares." Lawrence raised his eyebrows. "That's not typically how withdrawing a failed lawsuit works. You're not in a position to make demands." "We're still Harold's children," Audrey insisted, a note of desperation in her voice. "We deserve to be part of his legacy." I studied them both, searching for any sign of genuine grief or remorse beneath their entitlement. Finding none, I made my decision. "You'll retain the 20% shares each that Harold granted you," I said calmly. "You'll receive regular shareholder reports and standard dividends. But you will not have positions on the board or any operational involvement in the company. Those privileges were forfeited by your actions both before and after your father's death. You can't just shut us out completely." Bradley protested. I'm not, I replied. I'm honoring exactly what your father wanted, providing for you financially while protecting the business from your influence. The choice to accept those terms is yours, but they are not negotiable. In the end, they withdrew their petition without gaining any concessions. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile it later. As we left the courthouse, Audrey approached me one final time. You've won, Eleanor. I hope you're satisfied. This wasn't about winning, I told her honestly. It was about respecting your father's wishes and protecting what he built. I'm only sorry you couldn't see that. They walked away without further comment, and I haven't spoken to either of them since that day. Sometimes I wonder if Harold would have wanted me to try harder to reconcile with his children. But then I remember his letter and the painful clarity with which he assessed their characters. He had given them decades of chances. The decisions they made were their own. 6 months after the lawsuit concluded, I stood in the garden Harold and I had created together, watching the first crocuses push through the early spring soil. The cycle of seasons had continued despite loss and conflict, bringing renewal whether I was ready for it or not. The past year had transformed me in ways I never could have anticipated. Grief remained a constant companion, but its sharp edges had begun to soften. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, in business, in standing up for myself, in forging a new identity that honored my marriage while embracing my independence. Thompson Historic Properties was thriving under the joint leadership William Chan, and I had established. My background in art and architectural preservation brought a fresh perspective that complemented William's technical expertise and business acumen. Together, we had launched a new initiative focusing on affordable housing preservation in historic neighborhoods, something Harold had always wanted to pursue but hadn't fully developed before his death. Harold would be proud, William told me after we secured city approval for the pilot project. This honors his legacy while moving it forward. Using a portion of my inheritance, I established the Harold Thompson Foundation for Historic Arts Preservation, creating a scholarship program for young curators specializing in architectural history and community spaces. The foundation's first fundraising gala, held on what would have been our 36th anniversary, brought together people from throughout Harold's life to celebrate his values rather than mourn his absence. Perhaps most healing was reconnecting with friends and family who had supported me through the darkest days. Martha and Thomas remained my most steadfast allies, joining me for dinner every Sunday evening without fail. My sister Margaret, who had lived in Chicago for decades, decided to retire early and purchase a home just 20 minutes from mine. I've missed too many years with you, she said when she announced her decision. Life's too short for distance when it doesn't have to exist. With Margaret's help, I finally felt ready to make some changes to the house. We repainted the kitchen the sunny yellow I'd always wanted, but had compromised on for Harold's preference for neutral tones. I converted his formal home office into a bright art studio where I returned to painting, a passion I'd set aside during our busy years together. But I also preserved spaces that held his essence most strongly. His library remained untouched, his collection of maritime paintings still hanging exactly as he'd arranged them. In the process of cleaning his desk, I discovered small notes he'd hidden throughout the house, each containing messages of love or inside jokes from our years together. Finding them felt like continuing a conversation with him despite his absence. Bradley and Audrey remained distant figures, communicating only through lawyers regarding their shareholder interests. I had sent each of them a final letter after the lawsuit concluded, offering a path toward reconciliation if they ever wanted it, but received no response. While I had once hoped for peace between us for Harold's sake, I now accepted that some rifts cannot be healed without willingness on both sides. As I stood in the garden that spring morning, I felt Harold's presence not as a painful absence, but as a continuing influence. In the home we'd created, the business he'd built, and the person I'd become through loving him. The grief would always remain, but it had transformed into something more complex, and ultimately more meaningful than simple loss. That evening, I hosted a small dinner gathering for Harold's birthday. Not a somber commemoration but a celebration of his life with those who had truly known and loved him. Martha and Thomas, William Chan and his wife Grace, Lawrence, Margaret, and a few other close friends shared stories and raised glasses in his honor. I've been thinking about what Harold taught me, I said as we finished dessert. Not just through his words but through how he lived. He believed in preserving the past while building for the future. In honoring history without being trapped by it. I smiled at the faces around me. And most importantly, in choosing love and integrity even when those choices weren't easy. To Harold, Lawrence raised his glass. And to you, Eleanor, for carrying his legacy forward. As my friends echoed the toast, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since Harold's death. The path forward would continue to have difficult moments, but I now walked it with confidence in both his enduring love and my own strength. Life doesn't end with loss, though it forever changes. The will Harold left behind provided not just financial security, but a final expression of his trust in me to continue the story we had begun together. In honoring his wishes, I had discovered my own. What have you learned about family dynamics after loss? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when others tried to take advantage during a vulnerable time? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need encouragement to stand firm in difficult circumstances. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting what matters most, just as Harold did for me.